Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. You're catching the Knowledge Wave. This is day 2 of the conference, coming to you live from the Sheraton Hotel in Auckland. I'm Rob Neal, and with me my co-presenter Lotta McVeigh. What we're going to do in this little session is to give you an idea of what's coming up, look back a little at what happened yesterday, and to just count down to that first plenary session. So, first of all, let's have a look at what the media's been making of this particular conference. And Lotta, you've got some ideas of the New Zealand Herald's coverage.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, I do have the New Zealand Herald here. Their coverage is really quite concise. On the front page, there's a story, Advisors Give the PM and the Country Lots to Think About, which is basically a report that Helen Clark released to the conference yesterday, the Science and Innovation Advisory Council's report. And they're basically proposing that the government's research and trade promotion shifts away from primary production towards the new economic activities where support is needed. On the inside of the paper, there's a story from Assistant Editor Fran O'Sullivan, who basically says top New Zealand minds get down to the hard yards. Ms O'Sullivan said that day one, yesterday, was essentially a cheerleading session, the warm-up period to get everyone on board for the hard yards, and that those hard yards start today.
Thanks, Lotta. It's a similar theme in the Dominion, an editorial from the Dominion, which says hyped calls for New Zealanders to catch the knowledge wave will count for nothing unless the government fundamentally rethinks its approach to nurturing economic growth. Now, that's from the Dominion, an editorial. They say, for example, well, they give the background as to their reasoning for that, and then they end with this comment where they say, the government must therefore demonstrate the bold leadership so far lacking from successive governments. Doing nothing, they say, is not an option if New Zealanders are to preserve, let alone improve, living standards. So that's the editorial from the Dominion. There's also another story from the Dominion which is headlined, Keating Calls for Economic Union. This is a reference to the former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating in his session last night, in which he said that New Zealand should integrate its economy with the financial markets of Australia. But he rejected the idea of political union or any of the other paraphernalia, as he called it, that cuts across the issues of sovereignty. He made the recommendation that, unlike Australia, New Zealand had the opportunity to integrate with a market 5 times its own size, and that was more important than negotiating free trade agreements with North America, Singapore, Hong Kong or Chile. So that gives you some idea of what the newspapers are saying. Anything else that you've got there, Lotta?
As I say, the Herald coverage is quite concise. There's a double-page spread on the inside of the paper which talks about a lot of what the speakers were saying yesterday. There's also a story that says summit not just show this time. That sceptics hung back yesterday amid a generally upbeat mood on the opening day of the Catching the Knowledge Wave conference. Today, as we've heard from Ms O'Sullivan, the hard yards will begin. Okay,
so that's the look back at what the media was saying, the impact it's had. Let's now look ahead. The first session is on economic imperatives and global opportunities. The first speaker, David Teece, you may recall we interviewed him here on the program yesterday. He's the finance guy from UCLA in Berkeley. And then there's Craig Ventnor, who's I suppose best known because he won the race, if you like, to map the human genome, and he'll be coming in via satellite link courtesy of Telecom. And that's the first plenary session. Now, what have we got in the second session, Lotta?
Well, after a networking break, which I'm sure will be a cup of coffee, there is a speech from Sally Shelton-Colby, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, and she's talking on economic growth models. After that, there's Brigadier General George Yeo, who's the Minister of Trade and Industry from Singapore, talking about Singapore's growth strategy and no doubt what we can learn from that. And then there'll be a speech on the New Zealand perspective from Don Brash, Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
So what we're seeing here is throughout today we're going to be looking at some of the models. You may recall that countries like Ireland and Finland and Singapore have been suggested as models that we could take examples from, look at them, see what they do, see which bits we could take from them, which we could learn from. So those are the sorts of things that are going to be used today, and I see that some of the groups, the theme workshops that they're going to deal with this afternoon, take an individual theme like entrepreneurship, like innovation, and then they go into these groups and they discuss what it is that we can take from those models in those particular areas, and they're looking to come out of this with a plan, something which is an action plan. So that's what we can look forward to this morning. The conference delegates are just gathering, so let's go and have a look at the conference floor and see what's happening.
I had occasion last year to visit with my old economics professor, and he was kind enough to show me the economics exam for that year. And I was a little upset because it was exactly the same exam that I had sat 10 years earlier, question for question. And I pointed this out to him. I said, these are the same questions that I had 10 years earlier. And he said, but the answers are different. Welcome to Plenary 4, Economic Imperatives and Global Opportunities. Our speakers today are Professor
So we can see the warm-up, if you like, is just taking place where the delegates are being introduced to what's going to happen this morning. They're going to look at David Teece. They're just preparing for that. I think one of the things that's going to be so interesting for me to look at today is in many ways combine what we saw last night with what we're going to see in these models. I think that particularly Paul Keating and some of the comments that he made that really provoked us to think pretty carefully about where we're at. And now, take that all together, we can go back to the conference hall where the speakers are about to begin.
Plenary 4 expands the discussion begun yesterday on the role of knowledge and innovation in advanced economies, outlining the global economic and social trends of recent years. We will hear from two speakers this morning, Professor David Teece and Dr. Craig Ventnor. Professor Teece will speak for 30 minutes, following which we'll be joined by Dr. Ventnor by satellite for 30 minutes. Professor David Teece is quite simply an extraordinary New Zealander. He is a leading international researcher and scholar on the development of human capital and entrepreneurship, and is the founder of the Law and Economics Consulting Group, a global firm which employs more doctoral students than any other private sector organisation. The firm is listed on the New York Stock Exchange and was a pioneer in the concept of the virtual firm. It regards its physical offices as its least important assets. Professor Teece is a dual citizen of New Zealand and the United States, and is Mitsubishi Bank Professor of International Business and Finance and a Director of the Institute of Management, Innovation and Organisation at one of the world's leading business schools, the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Teece retains strong New Zealand links. He is Chairman of Canterbury Limited, a principal of several New Zealand investment funds, and maintains a home in Nelson. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor David Teece.
Good morning. The Prime Minister told us yesterday that the performance of the New Zealand economy is not meeting the aspirations of New Zealanders. That's true. The reforms of the 80s achieved much, yet rapid growth and dynamism are still to come. What I'd like to try and do this morning is diagnose some of the strengths and weaknesses of the New Zealand economy and society, and outline a few actions which I think might help. Like almost all New Zealanders, I'm keen to see the country do better. There's considerable learning, which is relevant to the New Zealand situation, I believe, which I'd like to share with you today, that comes from a plethora of studies that have been done in the Northern Hemisphere. After all, there are many other nation-states that have been worried about their future, including the United States in the 1980s. And so there is an enormous amount of work out there where scholars have tried to understand just the very issues that we're dealing with here in the New Zealand context. First, a couple of big picture comments. What is it that determines the wealth of nations? This is the most basic question in economics, and the one that Adam Smith tried to answer a couple of centuries ago. I think what we recognize today is that plentiful land, labor, and capital are insufficient to support sustainable wealth creation. It helps to have a good climate and plenty of land, but this is not the foundation of wealth. It's not the foundation, certainly, in the knowledge economy. In fact, many of the traditional factors of production, in particular land, are almost irrelevant in the new knowledge economy. Land is where you spend money, not where you make it. Farmers make money on the land, but not from the land. New Zealand farmers have made money for decades based on technology, on knowledge. It just happens to be the site where they make money and wealth is the land. It's important to bear this in mind. The organization of society, the political and legal systems are key ingredients of success. Absent the appropriate legal property systems and mechanisms for governments to credibly commit against takings of property, the benefits of a market economy cannot be realized. New Zealand, fortunately, has a stable political system, property rights which are recorded and respected, and some level of protection against government takings. This is fundamental. It enables technology to be developed and applied. This is what makes the difference between rich and poor. It's also critical to have a stable monetary policy, an educated labor force, open and competitive markets. We know all of that. But the deeper question is not what determines the difference between rich and poor, but amongst the stakes, amongst the nations that we think of as wealthy countries, what makes the difference in per capita income? And this is a much more granular problem that I'll endeavor to answer. And it's a much more difficult question, I believe, to answer. However, as I said before, there's been a lot of scholarship on this over the last 2 decades. The productivity slowdown in the United States, the ascendancy of Japan sent scholars scurrying back to the research laboratories and out into the field to learn what's going on and what's different. It used to be that the mainstream growth theories would tell us that it was really a matter about savings and capital accumulation, and that was the end of the story. But what we learned from the field studies and the other work that was done in the 80s is that it's institutions, innovation, and entrepreneurship which also matters. And if you don't get issues with respect to those factors right, you won't get the performance that you desire. So it really took the business school professors, the business historians and economists studying operations on the factory floor, strategy in the boardroom, and new business formation to figure it out. What are some of the things that have been learned? Well, you've heard about many of them already in this conference, but let me briefly recapitulate. Skills and risk capital. Highly skilled, specialized labor is critical to success. The United States illustrates this particularly well. Advantage in the design and to some extent the production of semiconductors, computers, and software all depended on the availability of large numbers of skilled engineers and scientists, no matter their national origin. Second is the availability of risk capital. Once again, U.S. experience illustrates this well. In both electronics and biotechnology, U.S. capital markets enabled the entry of new firms that quickly became industry leaders. New companies were spawned by bigger companies, such as Fairchild Camera, spawning just about every other firm in the semiconductor industry. So skills and risk capital are absolutely critical. So are institutions. The focus on institutions reveals the importance of universities and training institutes as critical factors in productivity enhancement and economic growth. This in turn establishes causation as flowing from institutions to what we have traditionally thought of as factors of production. The traditional textbook view was that factors of production determine wealth, and what we're now seeing is it's institutions that shape the factors of production that in turn determines comparative advantage. Let me turn to another set of factors that have been recognized to be of great importance: national culture and social values. Society must aspire to do better, and success needs to be recognized. Tall poppies are to be admired, not mown down. Entrepreneurship cannot be a dirty word, as it used to be in Britain and Denmark and other places through till the 80s. That's all changed in many other parts of the world. It needs to change here too. Entrepreneurs are very unusual individuals. They're likely to be mavericks. They're likely to have maniacal commitment, and hopefully they have sound judgment and good cheer. And entrepreneurship isn't an individual effort. Teams must be built and organizations expanded. The new economy entrepreneur cannot afford to be a loner. Another factor that's been recognized, and I'm sure Michael Porter will talk about this today, is the role of market demand. This, I might point out, is a more controversial point where scholars don't agree. Michael Porter and others have stressed the fact that it's the demand in the domestic market that shapes competitive advantage. And clearly, in many instances, that's true. In the United States, the role of the Department of Defense as a buyer of leading-edge microprocessors and other products from high-technology industries has been recognized as being important. In New Zealand, Canterbury International's success is in part based on the rugby heritage of New Zealand. But I think it's good news for New Zealand to know that market demand in the local market is not the only driver. There are many exceptions. Think about the Honda Motor Company in Japan. It did not build itself on the domestic automobile industry in Japan. It built itself on exports to the United States, and only subsequently did it achieve dominance back in Japan, or did it achieve a considerable market position back in Japan. And in fact, MITI tried to keep it out of the industry. So there's some optimism in the facts that while it's helpful to have leading-edge consumers at home, it's not critical. There are many, many instances of companies building markets abroad where the home market isn't necessarily all that big. I think it's also important to inquire as to what is the locus of innovation in the new economy. The answer to that's very easy, but we must always remember it. The answer is the locus of innovation is the business firm. However, we have to recognize that business firms are embedded in a dense network of alliances, that in the knowledge economy, no company has all the relevant skills, no company has access to all the relevant distribution and suppliers and the like. And so in the knowledge economy, it's increasingly important for networks to be developed and expanded and leveraged. And the United States, once again, illustrates this well, but you can take any advanced country and find a similar story. In Silicon Valley, networks of skilled scientists, engineers, and other professionals are important to the development of new products and services and the establishment of new businesses. This is because much new product development requires skills not already resident inside the firm. One interesting observation by some of my colleagues at Berkeley is that these networks not only span regions, but they also span geographically disparate territories. I refer in particular to the role of Chinese and Indian skilled immigrants in the United States. Chinese and Indian immigrant engineers are building professional and economic ties back to their home countries. These long-distance networks are accelerating the globalization of labor markets and enhancing opportunities for entrepreneurship, investment, and trade. And this is a point that I'll return to later when we discuss the role of the expatriate community to New Zealand's economic future. Well, what are some of the policy implications that flow from this? Let me first of all discuss the nation state. It's important for governments to get the basics right. Creating an open and competitive market environment that favors business formation and new entry without handicapping incumbents is fundamental. Fiscal and monetary policy that stimulates investment and risk-taking is essential. Light-handed regulation, which New Zealand has pioneered, is the way to go. Industrial policies to be effective ought not support particular firms and technologies. Governments cannot pick winners, and they shouldn't even try. Education and training which is tailored to enterprise needs is critical, but the direct role of the state in the market must be limited. In this area, in the new economy, governments can't legislate success. In this regard, it's important, I think, for participants at this conference to recognize that government planning or visions with respect to particular firms and industries is a recipe for failure. Well, this then puts the role clearly with the private sector. But what then about the private sector? What is the role of business firms? What can they do? The business firm is the engine of wealth creation in the modern economy. Firms and farms lie at the core of a nation's competitive strength. Firms and farms must be constantly upgrading skills and technologies and redirecting resources to meet the needs of an ever-changing marketplace. Firms must build difficult-to-emulate competences and employ these competences to design and produce products. Should firms fail to employ modern technology and win domestic and foreign markets, national competitiveness will be impaired. As I've said before, of critical importance, particularly to smaller firms, is alliances. But of critical importance also is the quality of top management. If top management makes strategic errors, companies suffer. And when companies suffer, nation states suffer too. commenting on RCA, one of America's great companies in the post-war period, the Radio Corporation of America, which is basically non-existent anymore, Alfred Chandler, the business historian, writes, if RCA had resisted the computer and avoided the curse of the conglomerate, if it had continued to concentrate, as did its Japanese competitors, on the consumer electronics market, the one it knew best, then it might have remained the industry path definer. In short, management screwed up, and RCA went down the toilet. So management can make a difference, not only on the negative side, but also on the positive side. It's a visionary leadership of giants like Watson at IBM that committed IBM to the 360 family of computers and turned a punch card company into what for a number of decades was the world's leading computer company. So management is absolutely critical to the equation, and that's something that we constantly need to remind ourselves of. I think Silicon Valley, where I come from, illustrates a lot of these points that I'm making. Even with the dot-com bust, Silicon Valley stands out as the preeminent example of industrial success in the post-war period. Many successes elsewhere, be it Taiwan, Singapore, or even Ireland, feed from it. Transformed from orchards to the world's greatest high-tech mecca, the success of Silicon Valley was not architected in Washington or in the state capital, Sacramento. Rather, it was architected by leading entrepreneurs and engineers such as Hewlett and Packard, Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Steve Jobs, Bob Swanson, and I'll also mention the name Frank Terman. He was not a business leader, but he was the dean of engineering at Stanford University and had an equally important role in shaping Silicon Valley. But Silicon Valley required from government a stable business environment, which it got. It was also able to access talent through an extremely open and flexible labor market. And it attracted capital from a budding venture capital industry. Absolutely key, as I said before, was the availability of a skilled workforce and an environment open to entrepreneurship. So government was a silent participant. It was, to a large degree, out of the way, at least in the formative years. What are the implications of these findings for New Zealand? First of all, I believe New Zealand has considerable strength. The reform movement, which began in the 80s, transformed New Zealand in less than a decade from one of the most regulated economies in the OECD to one of the most open. These reforms have provided the foundations for more rapid growth. They were necessary, but they're not sufficient. They did not guarantee high rates of economic growth, but by stepping out of the way in many sectors, government has provided the opportunity for the private sector to excel. So what are some of the weaknesses in the New Zealand economy? One of them, I believe, is management. Management is critically important to business performance, and as I said before, it's indirectly important to the national economy. New Zealand has many excellent managers, don't get me wrong, but I don't believe it's got its fair share. And I don't believe this is surprising either. I think there's two key reasons for it. One is that schools of management were a late invention in New Zealand. The modern business school in America dates to the 1890s when Harvard, Berkeley, and Wharton established schools of business and schools of commerce. Business schools in the modern model did not arrive in New Zealand until the 80s. Sure, there were schools of commerce, but in fact, accountancy was the key anchor of what was taught in most business schools until a couple of decades ago. So in short, training has been limited, and few students have gone abroad for the MBA degree because fellowships are typically not provided in that category. So New Zealanders studying abroad have generally chosen academic disciplines where they could receive financial help. The other main reason why there aren't as many excellent managers as the country needs is, in fact, that the government ran so much of the economy for so long. That has now changed, but there was a crowding out that went on through to the 80s, where, in fact, the training ground that existed in many other countries for management and management skills was simply taken away. Certainly, there's many examples of prominent New Zealand firms suffering from poor management. Stockholders have been the losers, but my point is that the loss doesn't stop with the stockholders. You can also find firms in the United States and elsewhere that haven't performed well, and I gave you the example of RCA. So management is an area where I think additional strength is needed. Education is another such area. Tertiary education is not adequately supporting the needs of enterprise. As was noted above, it's access to specialized skills that's critical to success. New Zealand universities, like many of their British universities that they emulated, have perhaps not performed in this area as well as they might. In this regard, I think it's helpful to compare the United States and Europe. The U.S. education system is widely regarded as a source of national competitive advantage. It has been quite accessible, and moreover, it has always had a strong practical component. As my colleague Nathan Rosenberg from Stanford writes, while the aristocracy in Europe expressed disdain for commercial affairs, American universities were perceived as a path to commercial as well as personal success, and university research and teaching were focused more clearly on these goals. Indeed, there is a free flow of faculty back and forth in the engineering, scientific, and business areas between industry and the university. Moreover, university professors frequently found new companies. I don't know if you're aware, but Netscape, Silicon Graphics, many of the companies in Silicon Valley were founded by university professors. Even Intel, which is known well in this country, one of the key founders was Gordon Moore, who for a number of years was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. My sense is that while such examples exist in New Zealand, they are too few. The university curriculum is slow to respond to the needs of industry, and industry, perceiving limited value in close relationships with the university, is often reluctant to spend time, effort, and money on university-industry relations, despite their established great importance to the innovation process overseas. University research must be expanded and made to complement, stimulate, and advance research done in industry. The curriculum must likewise be restructured to meet the needs of industry where it is not already doing so. Active advisory groups from industry should be involved with the university and vice versa. Let me turn to discuss entrepreneurship and venture capital. I think New Zealand does have a decent quota of active entrepreneurs. I have met a number of them. There's clearly a desire in this country to launch new companies and to build new enterprises. I've been impressed by the number of early-stage companies in formation, and I'm sure many will be successful. But perhaps reflecting my earlier concerns about business education, in some instances, there seems to be a high level of naivete and lack of understanding of all the bases that must be covered in order to achieve decent prospects of success. Business plans are frequently highly incomplete, and entrepreneurs are frequently loners. But entrepreneurship is about achieving new combinations. The entrepreneur's chief function is to bring things together and to build an enterprise. I think there are role models of successful entrepreneurs worthy of emulation. Members of the new breed need to be identified, brought forward, and their mentoring capabilities tapped. Mentoring and guidance appear to be the key missing element in new venture formation. This is something which a good venture capitalist can provide. Put differently, while funding is often put forward as a key limiting factor in New Zealand, I'm not sure that's the main problem. There are significant pools of money in New Zealand and Australia. What appears to be the scarcer resource, from what I can tell, and not just in New Zealand, but elsewhere, is the advisory and networking capabilities possessed by the United States and European venture capitalists. Another area of weakness is, I think, the industrial structure in New Zealand. New Zealand's small firms are simply too small. Very often they're sole proprietorships. They aren't scalable. Family firms, I think, are not as virtuous as they were once thought to be. The problem is that tiny firms can typically not afford professional management, and they certainly can't afford research and development. They simply do not have sufficient scale to warrant such expenditures. This is not a problem of lack of financial capital per se, it's a problem of scale. Specialist functions simply do not pencil out when the total employee count can be counted up on one hand. But what are the opportunities then in this context for New Zealand? Well, I believe there are a number. Top of my list is harnessing the expatriate community. As mentioned earlier, the knowledge economy feeds on and in turn rewards individuals with high skills. It also requires significant networks to be successful. New Zealand is not producing enough people with the relevant skills, and moreover, the Kiwi talent that does exist frequently migrates abroad. The expatriate community has to be thought of as part of the domestic labor force. I know that is a bit of a hyperbole, but I think if we begin to think in those terms, some interesting things may fall out. Given the inability to rapidly augment the supply of skills at home, tapping into the expatriate labor force is, I think, essential. There are two identifiable cohorts in the expatriate labor force. One is skilled New Zealanders who have migrated abroad. The other is New Zealanders like myself who have been educated abroad and simply chosen to build their careers overseas. Both cohorts have certain attributes in common. One, they're not alienated from their home country. They didn't leave New Zealand because they didn't like it. They left New Zealand because there were better opportunities abroad. And for many of them, certainly not all of them, it's not out of the question that they would return home for a good opportunity, even if this required a pay cut. I believe these expatriates need to be cultivated and recruited. One salient property of this expatriate community is that the whereabouts of these individuals is generally unknown to New Zealand, in the sense that, at least to my knowledge, no comprehensive database of names, addresses, and qualifications is available to either the public or private sector. Nor am I aware that there are systematic efforts to track these individuals and to leverage their networks to the benefit of the local enterprises. There are, of course, many obstacles to establishing such a list officially, not least of which is privacy. However, I suspect that most expatriates, if they could be found, would have no problem being listed in a directory. Perhaps a not-for-profit entity could be formed to collect, own, and manage such names. It's perhaps ironic in this regard that the easy assimilation of Australians and New Zealanders into overseas communities warrants the need for the formation of nationally oriented professional associations. The point here simply is that Australians and New Zealanders blend in when they go abroad. The Indians and Chinese don't. And in Silicon Valley, as I explained before, what has happened is that they have formed distinct professional units and associations which then link back to the home country. Their ethnicity keeps them together. The absence of ethnicity by New Zealanders when they go abroad means that they blend in chameleon-like to the local economy and can no longer be found without effort. I don't mean to suggest and imply that some New Zealand firms are ignorant of the potential opportunities associated with reversing the brain drain. New Zealand-based headhunters do shop abroad, but they shop abroad in an extremely ad hoc fashion. The second area of opportunity that I can identify is associated with restructuring education. While I am an educator, I will not pretend to know from a distance much about what's going on in secondary and tertiary education in New Zealand. With respect to the former, I will not bother to say much beyond the obvious. Effort and resources need to be spent in math, sciences, and technical areas of interest to business. I have a sense that art and culture have in recent decades received much-needed resources and attention. However, it's technical and engineering training in new fields and sub-disciplines which is key in the new economy. But as John Seeley Brown reminded us yesterday, the creativity of the artist needs to be woven into the product development process. So the fact that there is good artistic capability in New Zealand and good artistic training is also an asset, but only when combined with an understanding of technical and scientific areas. Teenagers need their horizons lifted, and academic, professional, and business accomplishments need to be recognized and rewarded. This has been long overdue. Ernest Rutherford and Alan McDermott are not as well known as the sports heroes. They should be. University education and research needs to be aligned with industry in the manner indicated earlier. This does not involve a sacrifice in research excellence. The great American research universities have achieved both academic excellence and relevance, both to industry and agriculture. This has been aided by the formation of interdisciplinary and applied departments with outreach programs designed to assist farmers and industrialists. Clearly, scale prevents New Zealand universities from being excellent across the board. The current emphasis on centres of excellence appears to recognize this. The bottom line is that links between the university and the business world need to be strengthened, but scale and resources are not the only ingredients to success. Absent good governance, a deeply ingrained penchant for excellence, and external peer review systems, universities and other institutions of learning are doomed to mediocrity. If they don't link in some fashion to agriculture and industry, they are also doomed to commercial irrelevance. I could go on to talk a little bit about the importance of research and development. I'll just simply end by saying that I do think additional resources are needed on research and development as well. But there's no point in turning on the R&D tap unless one also has the other elements of the equation in place. So additional research and development activity is certainly warranted, along with putting in place the complementary assets and making the institutional reforms that are needed for success. Thank you very much.
Few people can genuinely claim to have discovered some of the secrets of human life. Even fewer can claim to have led such dramatic breakthroughs in that area as our next speaker, Dr. Craig Ventnor. Dr. Ventnor is President and Chief Scientific Officer of Celera Genomics Corporation, the winner of the race to map the human genome. He is also founder, Chairman of the Board, and former President of the Institute for Genomic Research, a non-profit research institution. As a leader in biotechnical innovation, Dr. Ventnor's discoveries offer huge potential for new cures and treatments, and therefore the potential to improve human quality of life. Dr. Ventnor is one of the most cited scientists in biology and medicine. He's been the recipient of numerous awards, including last year's King Faisal Award in Science, and was recently selected as a runner-up for Time magazine's Man of the Year, and was selected as Man of the Year for the Financial Times. Dr. Ventnor's work touches many of the most crucial issues raised in the debate about the role of the knowledge in economic and social advancement. He joins us this morning by telecom satellite link from the United States.
So we're just waiting for the satellite link from Massachusetts in the United States. Dr. Craig Ventnor is standing by to make that presentation. As you may have heard, he's the man who's credited with having won the race to map the human genome, which is one of those scientific endeavours which is right at the heart of the idea of how you commercialise, how you research and then develop business from that. So we're waiting for that satellite link. When it comes, it's brought to you by TVNZ and Telecom New Zealand. Now, just to go back slightly while we're waiting for that, some of the things that David Teece brought up were really to try and, I think, isolate those things that New Zealand needed to do. I was intrigued by his idea of taking advantage of the expat communities, in particular to look overseas, see where the expats are, and to make the comparison that in Silicon Valley and places like that, you had ethnic communities like Indians and Chinese who could be easily identified, but the fact that New Zealanders and Australians melded so easily into the local communities meant that they had to do more work to go establish databases to find them. And essentially that people who were, say, headhunters who were going to look for New Zealanders, they tended to just ad hoc, whereas they needed to develop this database. He said, of course, there were privacy decisions that needed to be made, for example, whether they were going to have the information and make it publicly available. But he felt that most New Zealand expats who were overseas would not worry about that they'd be quite happy to overcome that particular problem. So that's what David Teece was talking about. We're standing by now for the satellite link to the United States. We're waiting for Dr. Craig Ventnor. Now, just to recap on some of the other things that David Teece was talking about, he indicated that he thought that when you looked at what it was that made for the wealth of nations, I mean, echoing really Adam Smith's idea, the wealth of nations, that you had to have very skilled labourers. And he looked at the example of the US and Silicon Valley in particular and said, okay, that's what they have. And he made the point, I think, quite vividly that in places like Silicon Valley there was a very close partnership between the local community and universities, pointing out, for example, that many of the startups that were in Silicon Valley were not prompted by government action, but were really hosted by that partnership with the university. Many of those companies were in fact started by university professors. And some of the very famous companies, Hewlett-Packard I think was one that he mentioned, Intel, they were companies that had a very close association with an academic background. So he was making the case for clusters in essence to be built around the research capabilities of universities. One of the other points that stood out to me, excuse me, one of the other points that stood out to me was when he said that you had to look beyond just the local demand, that it wasn't just a matter of local demand, which is obviously an area where New Zealand doesn't have a comparative advantage. He gave the example of Honda Motor Company, which is one which I hadn't thought of, and that is it actually went overseas and developed its market in the US before it went back to Japan, to its home country, to build up a competence there, so that necessarily we didn't have to worry that we didn't have a particularly strong local market. So that's some idea of what David Teece was saying, and now we can go to our satellite link with Dr. Craig Ventnor.
Delighted to be here with you this morning, your time. It's a beautiful day on the coast of New England. It's a wonderful sailing day, so one of the impacts of biotechnology obviously is to understand the fruits of biotechnology. Last time I was in New Zealand, I bought a very nice sailboat built in New Zealand and was out sailing on it this morning, so I think that's better than having to be there in the middle of winter. I was asked to make a few comments on my view of biotechnology and the future of biotechnology and the economic impact of that. I thought I'd do that by just giving you a few examples. In 1991, I published a paper in the journal Science describing a new method for rapidly sequencing genes. In 1992, a biotech company was started called Human Genome Sciences that started to utilize this technique for gene discovery. There was basically no genome companies in existence. It was even a new word in the early 90s. And several companies caught on, and this took off quite early. And somehow, just a little over a decade later, depending on how you measure it, the genome field has a value of somewhere between $100 and $500 billion US, mostly just based on US biotech and pharmautically related companies. This is an area that's under tremendous expansion in terms of it's an information business as biology moves into understanding the genetic code. For example, we published the first complete genome of a free-living organism in 1995. It took us 4 months of sequencing DNA to generate around 26,000 clones and 11 days on a Sun computer to assemble that genome. Just this last year, we sequenced the human genome and the mouse genome. Each took around, the human genome took 9 months, the mouse genome took 6 months. So instead of 26,000 clones, we sequenced 29 million clones in that same time period. New algorithms that we developed allow us to do what we did back in 1995. Instead of 11 days, it takes under 5 minutes. And so the information gets generated very, very rapidly. If we were going to start the Haemophilus genome project or the yeast genome project over again today, the yeast genome project took about 10 years of public effort, primarily in Europe. The Haemophilus genome project would take roughly 2 hours, and the yeast genome project about 6 to 8 hours. So the information we're generating just in one place at Celera Genomics is growing exponentially. We just recently announced a new effort to sequence all the genes in 40 to 50 people over the next year. By the end of this year, we will be able to sequence all the genes and regulatory regions in any one of your genomes in approximately a week for around $1 million. So that's a dramatic change from where we were a few years ago with the government program in US and Europe of a $3 to $5 billion, 15 to 20 year program. Within a year, we'll be down to under a week and on the order of $1 million. And we expect that growth to keep changing, where in the future, all of us can get our genome sequenced very rapidly and very inexpensively. That's going to have a huge impact on the understanding and the funding of medical services. And I think will have a big impact on lowering medical costs around the world as we move into preventative medicine. Computing is a very key part of it. We have a collaboration now with the US government to develop a much larger computer than our 1.5 teraflop computer that we have now, trying to generate 100 to 1,000 teraflop computer. And the physicists in the US government have now confessed that the biggest challenge is understanding the human genome and human biology, not trying to develop computers to simulate nuclear weapons blast or understand physics. So we're in the earliest stages of a tremendously rapidly growing industry. But biotechnology is not just about biology and medicine. It's about agriculture, including forestry, as our chairman knows. It's going to be a major role player, in my view, in the environment with CO2 sequestration, particularly if carbon credits become a viable economic package. Biotechnology also plays a role, unfortunately, in modern warfare and prevention of those diseases and early detection. And I also feel that biotechnology will play a major role in the future of energy production. We've seen from some of the organisms we found from the bottom of hydrothermal vents in the Pacific Ocean that are true autotrophs. They take carbon dioxide and hydrogen as an energy source, and they convert the carbon dioxide into methane, which can be used as a fuel. But other microbes can take that methane, actually split water and create hydrogen gas, which obviously can be used as a fuel. This used to be an effort in terms of biotechnology limited largely to the US and Western Europe. I think with the onset of the internet, where this information is being used as we speak by scientists in New Zealand and Australia, throughout other parts of the world, that there's no reason other than the lack of capital investment for biotechnology not to flourish everywhere. I think people confuse some of the ethical issues of biotechnology with genetic engineering. Most of what's done in biology and biotechnology is understanding knowledge, developing new treatments, new therapies, new diagnoses. And in the case of agriculture, most of the efforts are actually in terms of selection, not actual genetic engineering, changing the genetic structure of plants. So I think an important part of the future of biotechnology in this biological information revolution that we're in is increasing the public education about science and biology and not letting people's fantasies and the great stories that reach the press drive our view of things. Obviously, I'm very bullish on the impact of biotechnology. To me, it's a metaphor for just new knowledge. And as we come up with this new knowledge, we at Celera, we're trying to drive this into new treatments for cancer and other diseases. Scientists in most major academic institutions around the world are using this knowledge to try and come up with new understandings for biology. But the same techniques we've developed are now being used and applied to microorganisms, to plants, to understanding the minor differences that we have, for example, between humans and all other mammalian species, which will have a big impact on our future. But with that, I'd be delighted to take questions from any of you and see where you'd like to go. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions from the floor for Dr. Venter? We have a roving microphone to ensure that you can be heard. One over here, towards the middle, Richard. Just bear with us for a second, Doctor, while we get a microphone to our questioner.
Thanks very much. Dr. Ventner, I wonder if you have any comment on the use of patenting as a means of rewarding investment versus the need for information to be made publicly available so other researchers can leverage off that information, and do you have any comment on the tension between those two needs?
Well, in fact, I think it's an excellent question because it describes very well the confusion that's out there about patenting and what patenting is. The opposite of patenting, most people don't seem to realize, is trade secrecy. Patents are part of the U.S. Constitution because it was a system set up to encourage people who made discoveries and inventions to share those discoveries and inventions with the world so other people can build on those. So individuals and institutions, organizations that get patents guarantee that that information is published and put out there for people to build on. Most people equate patents with secrecy, particularly in university settings, and from people who just read the lay press. The reason you do this at university, because the first thing you do when you come up with a major discovery and you talk to your university patent counsel, the first thing they want to do is hold up a scientific publication to give them time to file a patent, when in fact the patent system is designed to ensure that the information gets disclosed, published so that other people can get it. The other confusion comes from some people, I feel, have tried to abuse the patent system, which is blindly filing patents on genes where they have no idea what the function is, just hoping they'll get some economic value. But it's very clear with human insulin, erythropoietin, GM-CSF, three major drugs that are on the market that have saved tens of millions of lives and helped tens of millions of people now. The patents for those genes was absolutely essential to bring those drugs to market. So the question is, how do you ensure those types of developments and ensure new developments get out on the market and help people and save people's lives, in contrast to some of the people that are just making blind economic bids without much value. In the US, the Patent Office has done a very good job recently of raising the bar, so you can't just get a patent on a piece of DNA without knowing a good function and role of it in developing a commercial product or a medicine. So I think while the Patent Office and the laws lag behind the discoveries in science, I think they're moving in the right direction.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Venter? Yes, one over here.
Dr. Venter, what do you think the impact will be of individual genetic profiles on food production? The implications for food production of individual genetic profiles?
Now, usually I think I've been asked almost every question or some variant of it before. I've never been asked the impact of human variation on food production. It's usually thought of as individualized medicine and individualizing healthcare for individuals. And even in that area, I think people have overreached tremendously with it. I think the fact that we only found 26,000 genes in the human genome, in contrast to the couple 100,000 that some people predicted, helps demonstrate, in fact, that none of you there or myself are alive because of genetic determinism, and that the genome in your genetic code does not determine exactly who you are in any exact fashion. So genetic profiling of individuals Well, they may, in terms of drug therapy, prevent you from being given a drug that might be toxic to you based on knowing you have a 20 to 50% chance of having a toxic reaction from a genetic test. That's very different than knowing what the exact outcome will be in any individual from any therapy. And the same is true for food and diets. I think we can understand people's individual metabolism much better by understanding the genetic code and protein structure in individuals that might have a dramatic influence on what type of diet and the emphasis they should have on fats versus carbohydrates that right now we just get as generic information averaged across the whole population and therefore is not attributable necessarily to any one individual. So I think it should have an impact on diets. Whether it has an impact on food production per se, I think that's a greater leap that I'm not willing to make at this time.
Do we have any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? There's one.
Dr. Venter, two questions, if I may. The first is, what was the biggest ingredient in the success of your corporation and the work that you're doing, and what was the biggest barrier? And the second question is, how's the Kiwi sailboat going?
Well, in terms of the biggest ingredient, there were actually 3 or 4 actual key elements. When we formed Solera, in fact, this is a great day for us. This is the 3rd anniversary of the formation of Solera. It started just 3 years ago with the goal to sequence the human genome and then move into human therapeutics based on that new information. As many of you know, much of the scientific community was very doubtful that these new high-throughput approaches and computational approaches would work. We had a new instrument designed by Applied Biosystems, our sister company. We had to build a new supercomputer that had not been built before. We had to come up with new algorithms and new methods. But I think one of the biggest helps was, and maybe this could have happened only in the United States, is we have a very strong investment community. Solera was started with $350 million initial capitalization as a single investment from what was then the PerkinElmer Corporation, is now the Aplera Corporation, that gave us a chance to really get going in an unfettered environment to solve all the other problems we had to solve. So it was a wonderful opportunity with people that were now the head of the Aplera Corporation were willing to take a risk based on a scientific idea that I and my colleagues had that we could change the future very rapidly. If it had not been for that capital investment, we would not have the human genome sequence now. The public effort still had another 10 years to go. So I think the strength of the investment community and the environment that encourages such investments in the U.S. is really responsible for having the human genome sequence today. Your other question, my sailboat is a 95-foot sloop that was built by Cookson there in New Zealand. We shipped it up to Florida, sailed it up the U.S. East Coast, and it's doing fabulously in the summer weather we have here. So I'm trying to find time to enjoy it around genomes.
Do we have any further questions? There's one over the back.
Dr. Venter, my name is Hugh Gollan. My question is bringing things back to New Zealand, sort of the opportunities of New Zealand to be networked into biotechnology, into genome industry, and the opportunity for New Zealand to foster some entrepreneurial activity here. We hear the number of 300 million US as your first fundraising. That sort of number is a little further out of reach to what most New Zealanders would perceive of here. But there is a biotechnology industry in New Zealand already. There are things happening here. This morning we've been challenged to think about networks and how New Zealand plugs into networks. We've also been challenged yesterday to think about acting on the periphery, looking for the opportunities around the fringes of core activities that are going on in the middle of industries already. Could you perhaps give us some of your views on where the opportunities may lie for New Zealand and New Zealand organisations?
I'd be happy to certainly speculate on that. In my view, the scientific talent in New Zealand is equal to the scientific talent that I've seen anywhere else. And the opportunities with the information, New Zealand is now successfully using the SLAR database and all the information we've generated from the human genome. So if anything's lacking there, it's the investment climate and the environment post that early investment to take things further down the road. I think the other aspect that exists in the U.S., but is also used by other countries, is the NASDAQ stock market that allows rapid value to be built. Now, I don't think the $350 million should be a benchmark for anybody. I think that's the largest initial capitalization by perhaps orders of magnitude in the U.S. as well. But the challenge of sequencing the human genome was also bigger by several orders of magnitude than anybody had considered before. I think most startup venture capital still is in the $5 to $30 million range in the U.S., but would exist as an investment climate where you can take that further. The scientists there certainly are capable, and I know some of them have made some absolutely amazing discoveries. That's what's going to drive the future of medicine, the future of agriculture and forestry, et cetera. So you have the right ingredients, so it's a question whether on its own the initial investment climate can be built, or whether New Zealand will just continue to export that talent to companies like Solara and others to use it. I think that's a challenge for New Zealand.
We have another question in the middle of the room.
Dr. Ventnor, I'd like to ask you a question. Solara is a standalone for-profit company, but you yourself came out of academic institutions. I was wondering if you could just touch upon the synergies that exist between corporations such as Solara and academic institutions within the US and worldwide.
It is a good question. I've been in academic institutions. I worked in the federal government and NIH for almost 10 years. I started my own not-for-profit research institute, Tiger, which is absolutely thriving with close to a $200 million endowment from stock that I've given it from both Human Genome Sciences and from Solara. And Solara is the first for-profit company that I've been associated with. So I've had a chance to see all these different areas, and what I've seen is great science and great discoveries can be made in all those different environments. And even though the NIH budget is going up almost 100% over the last few years, the investment that's required to understand the human genome and to make new discoveries can't be done by governments alone. And I think what we're seeing more and more of, that I'm certainly pleased to see, is great interactions and collaborations with some of those other organizations that I've been in. For example, I was delighted recently that the National Institutes of Health became a major subscriber to the SLAR database, as New Zealand has. So even though they've generated some of their own information, they realize the importance of the software tools and data that we've generated. So I think the future, at least in the US, is public-private cooperations and interactions. We now have some federal funding that's funding, for example, the sequencing of the rat genome, an important toxicology model for the pharmaceutical industry. And so we're not carrying that burden ourselves. And we're looking forward to more of those kinds of interactions. And I think that might be a way, for example, for New Zealand to build rapidly on its talent, is combining private investment with good public funding. So I think it is the future around the world because the challenge is so great, but the rewards should be sufficiently great as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for perhaps one final question for Dr. Venter, if there was one in the room. Yes, one down the front here.
Would you comment on the role of critical mass in scientific discovery? One of the problems that New Zealanders tend to do is work in isolation from each other. One of the characteristics, I think, of biotechnology in North America has been people working in teams, whether public or private. Would you want to comment further on that?
Well, I think that's a good observation, but it's a recent trend. I think scientists in general work in isolation and in competition with the group in the next lab, on the next floor, and the next building. I think it's the nature of science and science funding and opportunity. So it's hard to instill a great cooperation across the board in science. I think one of the things that I realized, and one of the reasons I left the US government to form the Institute for Genomic Research, was the existing academic structures do not lend themselves to the new multidisciplinary teams that we need to build for the future. So we started Tiger, we don't have traditional departments. Each investigator doesn't have their own lab space. We've put large multidisciplinary teams together, and we've done the same at Celera, where we have engineers, we have molecular biologists, computer scientists, computer engineers, software engineers, physicists, biochemists, all working together on different aspects of the same problem. And I've only been able to achieve that in the two institutions that I've driven. Other people are using similar models, but academia, by its very nature and the very structure of academic institutions, in its own way discourages those kinds of interactions and cooperativity. So I've had to leave those institutions to try and form a new environment that encouraged that cooperation. And I think a great deal of my success and my team's success has been due to those kinds of team efforts. So I think that is a challenge for academia, not just in New Zealand, but around the world. It's definitely not a New Zealand-specific problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Venter for his insightful contribution this morning.
Thank you for being with us. You're catching the Knowledge Wave, and it's coming to you live from the Sheraton Hotel in Auckland. Hi, I'm Rob Neal, and with me is my guest is Kevin Kenrick, and Kevin is the General Manager of Marketing at Telecom. Kevin, thank you very much for joining us. The session this morning, we saw David Teece from the US, a New Zealander. Something of a wake-up call, I thought. He delivered us a bit of a serve, didn't he?
Yeah, I thought it was actually very constructive criticism, which is going to be quite helpful from New Zealand. He highlighted that our natural environment with land and labour and lifestyle on their own are not enough to actually sustain economic growth. So the location is great. It's what we do in the location that's really going to make the difference.
What did you make of his comments about management? He was quite critical, for example, about New Zealand management.
Yeah, I think he had quite a strong perspective in terms of specialist skills, and that in comparison in the States, the business skills have been in place since the 1890s, whereas in New Zealand, we really came on stream in the 1980s.
Yeah, I hadn't realised that. I hadn't realised that we'd had sorts of schools, but they weren't of that management style, or that they were so established in the US.
Yeah, and I think his focus was saying that we need to actually build the skills, the specialist skills that are going to be relevant to business, and that it's important that we have this cohesive working relationship between the education institutions and the business community, and it's really the juncture of the two that's actually going to deliver innovation for New Zealand.
What about the idea of the expat community? He came up with this idea that you could utilise virtually the expat community, New Zealanders living overseas, either those that have trained overseas and stayed there or those that have gone overseas for jobs. Your opinion of that?
Well, I think it was great actually hearing from an expat. So, you know, here were the views from someone who said he is committed to and would like to be a part of ensuring New Zealand's success, and really saying that, you know, market demand domestically is really going to struggle to support our aspirations. And
we've always known that, though, haven't we? I mean, we've always known that the local market wasn't big enough and that we were going to have to go into the bigger pond.
Yeah, but I think what David Teece was telling us is that to go into the bigger pond, you really need to leverage the networks and the relationships that you've got, and that we need to be more confident about tapping our expats on the shoulder and asking them to help us and work with us, and to encourage them to drive those connections.
I sort of get the impression from quite a few speakers that there is this man alone sort of New Zealand idea, and we've got to get over that, and we've got to network, and we've got to make alliances. Is that something that you're picking up on?
It is. I think it's, I mean, we're in the business of enabling people through communication, and I think, you know, our recent advertising is really showing how people are being connected around the world and in different locations. I think what David is telling us is that we can't do it alone, that we need to network together, but that we've all got these resources we can draw from, and we should be unashamedly doing that.
So do you see any evidence of people being willing to do that, to overcome the idea of man alone, particularly those sort of scientific researchers who may feel that they don't want to share it with the rest of industry? I mean, are you seeing those people come forward to you?
I think there are some shining examples in New Zealand. I think Ian Taylor with the animation graphics in Dunedin, that was really a big part of bringing the America's Cup visuals to life, and is now selling that benefit in the PGA Tour, and is now selling that in rallying worldwide. But I think we need more than a few lone voices. We need a community that works together and celebrates intellectual and commercial success as much as sporting success.
So you would see the lesson that comes from Ian Taylor's operation, that being in Dunedin or better location is really not a disadvantage in that case?
Well, absolutely not. He actually has the benefit of the lifestyle of Dunedin, but actually uses communication technology to link himself to the rest of the world and do it in a way which is commercially viable.
What else did you see in David Teece as part of the wake-up call? What else did you pick on there?
Well, I think the other thing from David was all about the culture and the social values, which is about being prepared to make heroes of our entrepreneurs, actually celebrating commercial success rather than shying away from it. And I think that that's a part of maturing of society, which is an area that we as a nation need to grow up and really realise that that is part of our ongoing economic viability.
Yes, I must admit some sort of dual feeling there. You're sort of like harking back to the 80s and relitigating Rogernomics, if you like. Do you embrace success or do you not? But it is coming back that it's necessary. It's not a matter of value, it's more a matter of you've got to do it.
I think, I mean, the other strong thing from David was actually saying that the role of government is actually about creating an environment, and that government shouldn't lead it but should support it. And he gave Silicon Valley as a great example of that, where it was actually the commercial sector and the educational institutions that led that. And I think, you know, it's easy for us to point the finger at government rather than actually pull together as business community, as educational institutions, and actually just make it happen.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd appreciated that they went from sort of orchards to high-tech park, and that so much of that was really attributable to people who were from universities.
Yeah, I think it was surprising for a lot of us in the audience to hear that, and I think, you know, there were plenty of examples where the education institutions played a big part in the success of the economy in the States. A big opportunity for us to learn from that.
So what's the big takeout for you? What are you going out of this conference or that particular session with?
Well, I'm taking out of it that we need to build the skills. We actually need to use communication technology to link ourselves with expats around the world, to make those networks, to make those connections, and really be a lot more front-footed about commercial success, and using that as to underpin and support the lifestyle that we all love and enjoy.
Kevin Kenrick, thank you very much. Kevin Kenrick, who's from Telecom New Zealand. As we've been doing throughout the day, and yesterday, we've been looking at some of the things, the research work that's being done at Auckland University, or the University of Auckland. And one of them that I want to draw to your attention is one that focuses on the human heart. It's a world-leading technique, and it uses mathematical and physical equations of the human heart, and it's been transformed into a computer program. It maps it right down to its core, to its essence. And at the university's Department of Engineering Science, they're taking that particular technique and using it not just to save people's lives, but also to continue developing cutting-edge technology. Lotta McVeigh with this report.
At the University of Auckland School of Engineering, they're working on telephones of the future.
You have one new message. Hey, it's me. I'll pick you up at 8 to go to the movies.
And shop assistants of the future.
Yes, I can help you. Your order has been placed. You'll receive it in a few days.
But what do these computer chip kids have to do with this?
What I'm doing here is I'm scanning this bone. So basically I'm digitizing it, which we use later on to generate anatomical models.
Or this?
So Dwayne, you want to stick the membrane on the rig now?
It's all thanks to the work of this man, Peter Hunter, Professor of Engineering Science. He spent years working on the world's first computer model of a human heart.
It's taken 20 years of ongoing research. There have been a number of things that have come out along the way, so I think some of the recent more commercial outcomes are sort of serendipity outcomes from that basic research program that certainly weren't anticipated when we started.
That not-so-basic research program used mathematical and physical equations to map the human heart, right down to its very core. Professor Hunter's team then mapped the lungs, and now they're working on building a completely accurate virtual knee. Those computer chip kids are a successful commercial spin-off using the same software.
It's enormously satisfying to see work that comes out of basic research going out into actual application. I think most people here really enjoy that combination of doing basic research and seeing it applied to clinical areas or commercial activities.
By taking the heart model into the commercial world, Professor Hunter's team are saving drug companies millions of dollars in testing drugs. And they're using it to help New Zealanders get better.
I work very closely with the head of cardiology at Green Lane Hospital. He's excellent. He is interested in research. He understands the research aspect of what we're doing, and he's prepared to help as much as he can.
There's no doubt Professor Hunter's team love their work, and that's why he believes that projects like his can help combat the brain drain and offer an incentive for Kiwi scientists to stay at home.
We do a wonderful job of teaching people at primary, secondary, tertiary level, and then we export them, and the flow of grey matter overseas means that that's our greatest asset going overseas, often to be lost forever. We have to create a climate where those people want to come back because there are opportunities for them back here. It's happening already with my own group. People are starting to come back because they can see the prospect of very interesting, reasonably well-paid jobs back here that involve applying basic research to application and generating commercial opportunities.
Not to mention the prospect of having some fun.
Thank you for watching the Knowledge Wave Conference live on Sky.
It's got to be something that's going to go to MTV, surely. That's Lotta McVeigh with that report. Now, Lotta is also moving around the conference, and it's time to go looking for Lotta. I understand that she's in the media room, so come in, Lotta McVeigh.
Thanks, Rob. Hello again from the Media Centre, where, as you can see, the journalists behind me who are attending the conference are taking what they have heard and turning it into copy to send out to New Zealand. It's also where we're maintaining our website, which again is knowledgewave.org.nz. A reminder that you can obtain not just speech notes from the speakers on that website, but also biographies and backgrounders on those speakers and what they've done thus far in their lives. We also have an email address, which again is knowledgewave@extra.co.nz. We'd love to hear from you. What do you think of the speakers so far? What are your thoughts in general about the conference? How connected do you feel to what's happening here at the Sheraton in Auckland? Now, we have had some emails in so far. One here from Patrick McPhee, who writes, "It is my belief that the real knowledge wave our nation should focus on is knowledge, design, and design thinking." He says, as a nation, we are so preoccupied by what is. Our psyche is geared towards the judgment of ideas and individuals, as opposed to the concept of possibility and the development of concepts based upon the aspirations of New Zealanders, similar perhaps to what Edward de Bono was saying last night. He continues, if we as a nation are committed to embracing all that the title of this conference would imply, then we must first and foremost begin by committing to the development of the very tools that direct our every action. These being the tools of the mind. We must equip ourselves with the tools of creativity and design seamlessly through our industries, their business leaders, and our education system. Thank you for that, Patrick. I have another one here from Arthur Nonaka. Apologies if I've pronounced your surname incorrectly. Arthur writes, it should be noted that despite the perceived isolation from the trading routes and away from all the major continents, New Zealand is in fact in an enviable location. Arthur says, New Zealand is the first major landmass to see the start of the new day and the beginning of the working week. We are also the first market to begin the trading day, as well as the first market to open as soon as Wall Street in the US closes. As such, we are in a unique position to lead the world in its action and reaction. Arthur also says the internet has obviously put a lie to our isolation being because of our location. It has made the world just a click away. Suddenly the world has become such a small place and all the perceptions of size and location just get chiselled away. And he ends with, our battle cry in this knowledge wave is we lead and the rest of the world follows. Thank you for that, Arthur. Now I have another one here from Sam Habib, who's talking about patents and the problem he's had patenting an idea in New Zealand. Craig Venter was talking about that in his telephone link earlier. Sam says, I'm a Dutch engineer, studied in a Dutch university, have an MSc in automatic control systems, came to New Zealand in '93 and couldn't find a job. He says, I invented a few things, each of which I still believe could be a commercial success. One patent attorney charged me over $700 only to make the search and told me that to get the patent it would cost me something around $5,000. Sam says, I paid him the $700 and went home and destroyed all the papers and decided not to bother. His message is, if you're really serious about surfing the high waves, then I suggest starting some kind of a fund for those poor inventors to help New Zealand's ideas get protected and developed. Sam, actually, you could, in fact, apply for an enterprise award from Industry New Zealand. Some entrepreneurs have used that to patent their products, so perhaps if you contact Industry New Zealand, you might want to check if you meet their criteria. And I'll end with an email from Malin Patu, a high note, you might say, to end on. Malin says, I must wholeheartedly congratulate the organisers of this conference for the insight and commitment to bring this conference into being. He says, I'm getting really enthused with every speaker of this conference and have already been in contact with the local Hamilton City Council, offering my full, undevoted support for anything they decide to do after the conclusion of this conference. Well, that's good to hear, Malin. I hope others are getting as enthused as you are. So if you do have anything you'd like to let us know, we'd love to hear from you. The email address again is knowledgewave@extra.co.nz. That's it from the media room for now. I'll be back later on with more updated emails. Back to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Lotta. So we're just about to go for a break. All that enthusiasm for the organising committee. We thought we'd better bring in Bridget Wickham from that organising committee and we'll talk to her after the break. So back in 3. Thank you for being with us. I'm Rob Neal and this is Catching the Knowledge Wave. It's a conference and as you can see the delegates are just making their way back to the next session. But to give you some idea of what's been happening this morning, we have with us Bridget Wickham. Bridget is from the organising committee. Bridget, David Teece, Craig Venter, what did you make of the morning sessions?
Both speakers were extremely interesting from quite different perspectives. David, who is a New Zealander living in California for many years, a professor of in the House Business School there, had some conclusions about New Zealand and what it might do for the future. Some of the common themes that are emerging, talking about education, skills development, the importance of good venture capital and stock market institutions. Craig Venter, who is the scientist that's been responsible for the sequencing of the human genome, was extremely interesting. And we had a video link with him in Hyannis, Massachusetts, and so we were able to hear from him about the ways that he's built his company and what he's been looking at in terms of the sequencing of the human genome and what that might mean for the future.
I think what really fascinated me about was just the sheer pace of it and saying that, you know, they could now map an individual's genome in the space of sort of a week and it just cost $1 million.
Exactly, and when we think about the way we can treat illness, for instance, that's very specific to the individual as distinct from the general way we approach illness, general health issues, maintenance of weight, smoking, all of these things can be facilitated by really understanding the individual makeup of each human and designing treatment accordingly.
I was interested that he thought that would mean that health costs would actually go down, that you could see a benefit in that in terms of pushing the prices down.
probably means less waste, more specific treatment, more targeted, more effective, and so therefore less cost.
I was intrigued by some of the questions. I mean, for example, the idea that there was this tension between inventing something and having to commercialise it, which you had to share it with other people, or the business versus the pure invention. Is that something that you're cognizant of, that you think is critical?
Exactly. The tension between pure science and how you patent it or protect it and then make it available to others to develop is very much a key issue for the universities and for the start of new businesses, because what we do want is that ideas do get translated into a commercially relevant environment so that they're built into new products or new services.
Now, wearing your other hat at university development, that must be something that you're critically aware of. It just keeps coming up.
Exactly, and it is a theme. We need to facilitate that movement between the universities and business, make sure that good ideas are track through into become commercial enterprises, and the necessary steps in that process. It's very important that we think about those and make sure that they're working well.
Okay, that's what we've seen on screen, if you like, from the speakers, but there are the informal networks, the off-stage groups going on. What are you hearing from them? What are you picking up from them?
Well, I think what is really interesting and people are really noticing is how much commonality there's emerging between the various themes, and that will emerge as we go into this afternoon and we think about how we can specifically drive some programs and initiatives in New Zealand. We've seen a lot about the importance of education right through the whole education system, literacy and numeracy, early childhood education, later on into tertiary education and the processes for the universities and integrating especially with the business community, but more broadly. There's a lot of talk about the importance of venture capital and capital markets and fundraising. There's a lot of talk about social community identity and cultural identity and really shaping the future for New Zealand as distinct from for another country.
So how do these sort of networking groups operate? What's the structure? What's the process?
This afternoon?
Yes.
Yes, there's 5 themes this afternoon, and each of the delegates has chosen to go into one or other of those themes. And during today and the early part of tomorrow, there are further speakers and then a chance to brainstorm and develop ideas from all of the delegates and with assistance from the overseas speakers.
So they're sort of instructed to come up with action plans on those specific topics?
Exactly, and they will be reported back tomorrow during the latter part of the session tomorrow. Those action plans and ideas that have been initiated from everybody who's participating will be reported back.
So their mandate is actually to come up with ideas?
Exactly. This is not back to the Talk Fest. People are very keen to move from great ideas and very stimulating discussion into something that's very action-oriented.
Okay, Bridget Wickham, thank you very much. Bridget Wickham from the organising committee bringing us up to date there, and particularly looking at those informal networks. Now, in looking at the things that the University of Auckland research already does, time to look at pigeons. And in fact, I think really rather than the pigeons, it's a biologist who has made a breakthrough in understanding how animals such as pigeons navigate their way in the world. At the Department of Engineering Science, he's continuing his groundbreaking research while working on increasing the variety of students taking up science education. Let's take a look.
We all know that pigeons fly home, but how do they know where home is?
Animal navigation is one of the longest standing and greatest unsolved mysteries in biology.
The University of Auckland biologist Dr. Michael Walker believes he's found out how, after spending 20 years studying the magnetic sense of animals.
We believe that we can explain, potentially, the navigational abilities of a wide range of animals that travel across the oceans, either in the sea or in the air. And at the moment, we're the only ones working on the problem in the world.
Dr. Walker's the only one working on it because dozens of biologists before him have found it impossible. And he believes being a New Zealander has made all the difference.
What has helped to sustain me was that the exposure here in New Zealand to 2 intellectual traditions that solved the navigation problem in very different ways has given us a comfort that just because we can't understand it all now doesn't mean we won't be able to understand it in the future.
The 2 intellectual traditions he's referring to are the Māori and European ways of navigating their way to colonise New Zealand.
Commanding human achievement
the discovery of the islands of the Pacific and the colonisation of those islands.
And in one sense, Dr. Walker is following in the footsteps of his ancestors.
What you could say is that the navigators of the past deliberately went out exploring in the unknown parts of the Pacific Ocean to see what they could find and to come back and report it to their people at home, what they had found. That is very, very much like discovery now in science. Now, what's the conclusion that you come out with of this?
Another focus of Dr. Walker's has been to encourage today's Māori and Pacific Islanders into the world of scientific discovery.
What we've done here at the University of Auckland is to reach out to students of Māori and Pacific Island extraction as they enter the university, and to offer them support from students like themselves to assist them to make the transition to university and to university study.
The scheme has been immensely successful. It's resulted in a tripling of numbers of Māori students enrolled in senior undergraduate papers in biological science at the University of Auckland.
With regards to teaching, the Māori and Pacific Island interventions have also been very, very satisfying because they achieve a win-win outcome, a triple win. They're a win for the students because the students achieve success. It's a win for the university in that it is delivering success to an important group that is underrepresented in our university community. It's delivering a win to society.
And a win for greater understanding of the animal kingdom.
Lotte McVeigh with that report. You're with Catching the Knowledge Wave, and if you want to send us your ideas and take part, then why don't you contact us on the email address, which is knowledgewave@extra.co.nz. Now, the delegates are just about to go into the next session, so let's just recap as to where we are. This morning we've heard from David Teece, Director of the Institute of Management, Innovation and Organisation at the University of California, UCLA at Berkeley. And his focus was, in particular, I think, something of a wake-up call for what we needed to do in New Zealand for the partnerships, the alliances that needed to be built. And then we heard from Craig Ventnor, and his sort of global perspective was much more on the opportunities and just the sheer things that were coming out of things like, the Genome Project, where he has done the mapping. Ideas like that which would put down the cost of healthcare, for example. So if you like, those are very global perspectives, the sorts of things which we need to do that we can learn from Silicon Valley in particular, and in this case the opportunities that are arising from new technologies like the Genome Project. So they've had their break, they've begun their networking, and as Bridget was talking about, a lot of that off-camera backroom conversation is so important so that when they go to the afternoon sessions, they do have tangible ideas that they can work on. They have a mandate that they have to come up with ideas which are going to be action plans so that this isn't just seen as a talk fest, that there is something to come from it.